So what we have here is probably the worst foreign policy disaster of America in the 20th century that has been really only barely covered. And so what I set out to do was to take an in-depth probe of the military events that led to the fall of South Vietnam to figure out exactly what had happened after all you guys had left. Because as everyone tells me, you guys were winning when you were there, right? So, see, exactly. So this view, because of this rapid collapse in 55 days, it just really cemented this image of South Vietnam as this really weak vassal state that was totally propped up by American arms, money, and firepower, and just waiting to be pushed over the first strong gust that came along. Well, that's the accepted view among most historians, but as I try to show in my book, that's not really what happened. And just as a sort of a sidebar, the title of the book, Black April, is actually what the South Vietnamese call the fall of the country, which I thought was a perfect summation of what they call it Tang Tu Den in Vietnamese, which means Black April, which for them the sort of semi-poetic way of talking about what happened to themselves in the fall of their country. And the worst part of it is that the things that were televised at the end, the riots in Da Nang, people trying to fight their way on the planes, fight their way on the ships, the bloody carnage of the retreat down from the Central Highlands, these just further reinforce this image in American minds of this incompetent South Vietnamese military. And so I really set out to look at that and see if that surface view was true or not. So when I started looking at this, I discovered that it wasn't true. And I'll show in the book, and I'll tell you a little bit about it later, is that from the time the Paris Peace Accords were signed until the US Congress started cutting off the aid in late 1973, the South Vietnamese were essentially winning on the battlefield for a variety of reasons. So most people believe, and this is kind of like the first myth, most people think that the North Vietnamese didn't really make a decision once they had signed the Paris Peace Accord in January '73. They had not made a decision to militarily attack South Vietnam until late 1974. That is totally incorrect. The South Vietnamese, the North Vietnamese, excuse me, actually began, once the Paris Peace Accords were signed, their initial thought was they had taken such a brutal beating on the battlefield in 1972 offensive that they would do what was called political struggle, which essentially meant low-level terrorism, low-level attacks, but essentially propaganda, efforts to drag people into their zone of control, to build up their zone, a political struggle for control in South Vietnam. Eventually they hoped to win what was called a coalition government. So the second myth, the South Vietnamese were weak and ineffective, and that's why the country fell so quickly. So from January '73 until March '75, when the final offensive began, most ARVN units held their own and generally defeated the Pathan attacks without US air support. Most of the losses they took were small outposts where the North Vietnamese were able to mass battalion on a company, regiment on a battalion, and simply could overwhelm them with firepower and numbers. And in most cases, the low level of attacks, as the North Vietnamese are going to ratchet up the attacks in South Vietnam, most of the times when the South Vietnamese were dug in and waiting for them, they pushed them back no problem. It's the times when the North Vietnamese can mass a significant force on an isolated outpost where they can't get the air power in or can't get the artillery in to support them or reinforcements in, where the North Vietnamese win. But by the summer of '74, when the aid cuts had hit, and the South Vietnamese had to withdraw deeper into their outposts, they had to cut the ammunition supply rate. They were down to 105, we'll go into this in more details in a second, 405 rounds a day per gun. The North Vietnamese launched a major offensive to the west of Da Nang at a district called Tung Duc. And they took 2 regiments from the 304th Division, and they pushed out a Ranger battalion, and they were heading right towards Da Nang. And General Truong up in I Corps had to move the airborne division in and block them. But this battle right here is going to be very, very, very key. People always think about Phuc Long as the loss of Phuc Long in December of '74 as the key battle. It's not. We're going to talk about Tung Duc in a second. So again, there's heavy fighting down in 3 Corps. The siege of Duc Way, which is a small town to the west of Saigon, was under siege by a Pathan division. The 3rd Armored Brigade, in sort of a classic armor move, swung behind their lines, cut them off in Cambodia, absolutely destroyed the 5th Division. So all these myths about the South Vietnamese were corrupt and ineffective are flat out not true. And you can see right down here, the ARVN takes 15,000 casualties in I Corps 1974 alone. That to me is not an army that's not fighting. All right, so this Battle of Tung Duc we're going to talk about. So they move 2 regiments from the 304th Division off the ceasefire line in Guangxi. They swing them all the way down through the hill country, all the way past Haivan Pass, down to outside of the west of Da Nang. And they attack, and basically it's a stalemate. The airborne push them off one hill, but they can't retake the town. The PAVN can't move forward. It's this battle against the most elite South Vietnamese unit, the Airborne Division, by just one of the regular force units, that convinces the planners in Hanoi that they have now regained parity with the South Vietnamese, that their forces have now regained the strength that they had lost in the 72 offensive in terms of manpower, in terms of artillery effectiveness, in terms of coordination in the battlefield. If they can now stand and fight with South Vietnam's best forces, they have now reached battlefield parity, and it's time to make a bigger moves, all right? So what they had done in the summer of '74 was to attack, as I told you before, attack just enough to drain the South Vietnamese, but not enough to get the Americans to come back in. So what they would do is they would attack one area, fight a battle, pull back, attack another area, pull back, attack another area. So they're fighting one at a time instead of concurrently. So now they thought, okay, we're going to plan for the 75 offensive, and now we're going to launch a full-scale invasion, and now we're going to launch attacks concurrently across the country and not one at a time. All right, so I wanted to go into some of the things about the RVNF. As I've told many of my South Vietnamese friends, they certainly were not the second coming of the Waffen-FF, or Waffen-SS, or Patton's Third Army, but they certainly were not the weak and ineffective army that they're often portrayed. So I took a look actually at the commanders who were actually commanding from battalion on up, and I actually did a study. And I said, how many of these guys deserted their troops? And as it turned out, there are 50 some odd Ranger battalion commanders and group commanders. Not one single battalion commander deserted their troops. So if you added up all the Marines, took the elite units, the Rangers, the Marines, the Airborne, some other ones, as 100 battalion or group or regimental commanders, only 3 guys left their troops, and that was on the last day. So this story about how these guys deserted their troops is just not true. There's some of the younger guys did, but the senior commanders mostly didn't. So what South Vietnam had was the same problem it always had, an enormous 800-mile long left flank that is almost impossible to defend. And they had the same problems that we'd always had, getting good intelligence on the enemy, knowing where they're massing, and then having the firepower and the reserves to stem those enemy attacks. And so the problem is that it wasn't that they couldn't stop the North Vietnamese, but they couldn't stop with a simultaneous countrywide offensive without US air power. The country is just too narrow in its width, at its waist, and they didn't have the reserves and the firepower to stop that initial attack and then counterattack. And that was their problem. That's why the 72 offensive got blunted, was because of the US air power backed them up enough, the guys on the ground. So the fourth myth, most US writers, again, because they were either in Saigon or not really paying attention to what was going on, wrote that the ARVN didn't put up much of a fight, especially in the last battle for Saigon, and that's totally not the case. So from the 5th of April to the 30th, NVA forces in 3 corps alone lost 3,500 dead. 3,500 dead, and 8,000 wounded. And for those of you who ever served with the Vietnamese Marines, and I'll talk about I Corps in a second, the Vietnamese Marines had tried to regroup at Vung Tau. They had enough guys that they were able to form 2 brigades. They put the 2 brigades essentially on a line on the eastern side of Saigon, and the 6th Marine Battalion was holding the town of Honai on Route 1, which is just to the east of Bien Hoa. Now, Lieutenant Colonel Le Ba Bin, who actually lives in San Jose, who's got a Silver Star and 2 Bronze Stars, was commanding the Vietnamese 6th Marine Battalion. He held that town against an assault by an armored force of the PAVN 341st Division. And he held that town, and the entire Marines, the Vietnamese Marines, basically lit up the whole North Vietnamese army until the Vietnamese were ordered to pull back across the Dong Nai River. So there are continual instances of the South Vietnamese fighting very desperately, but by this time they're almost out of ammunition, and they just don't have enough troops to cover the ground. And I think that the book is really trying to set the historical record straight, that what you guys did in helping to build that country and helping to build that military was not in vain, that I think with steady American support after the war, that there was a more than even chance that South Vietnam could have survived. The problem is that they could not survive without American aid and American air power to back them up. The country, as you all know, was just not geographically able to be defended very easily. So.
Your books impressed me, particularly me, and so this is sort of my question, in that you seem to have a strong fascination with Vietnam. Have you ever visited there? Do you speak the language? What's the attraction? The real thing is, what's the attraction to the conflict? Why, you're spending so much time, and I read through all 3 of your books, and you're starting another one. Right. And you're younger than me by a whole bunch. So you weren't there when I was, unless you had some in your mouth. But if you, why are you dedicated to this? I have an idea, but I'd like to get your response.
I think it's a war that has been badly, I don't want to say reported, but looked at from a historical point of view. It was so politicized. There are so many people who, on the anti-war side, have managed to grab a hold of and keep the nature of what's called the historiography of the war, and they're saying X, Y, and Z happened. But when you start talking to the Vietnamese, you start talking to vets like you see that the X, Y, and Z just doesn't pan out. Doesn't match reality. So there's only a handful of us, I would say, on the sort of the revisionist side, who have struggled, I think, to tell the truth, not only about what was really going on in Vietnam, but what's really going on with the South Vietnamese, which is a whole different story that most Americans don't know. And that's what I'm really trying to portray is a balanced view of our allies. They were not, as I said, the second coming of the Waffen-SS, but they weren't these incompetent bumblers either. You've got to, if you're going to talk bad about them, and there's a lot of things to talk bad about them, you also got to say, you know, when they did good, and they did good in lots of places. So to me, it's just being fair and balanced and teaching and showing the history as it really happened and not through a political lens.